Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Does the set look a little different to you? We thought we would make some effort to celebrate, at least recognize the holiday. Yeah. Yes, it's not a religious holiday unless, I guess, you're a Druid or there's probably some religious group for which it might be a holiday. Anyway, the Catholic faith has, is it All Saints Day?
All Saints Day.
All Saints Day, and that's technically tomorrow?
November 1st.
November 1st, okay. So anyway, you can tell I'm not Catholic. But so we wanted to at least, get in the spirit of things. And along that road, we thought, well, maybe we should choose a topic that might be fitting for the occasion. And Marlea, being the industrious, imaginative researcher and developer that she is on these topics, I will hand it to you to introduce our topic this week.
Yeah, so this week we're going to be discussing the Menendez brothers. And, if you were around in the 90s watching this case, it was right along with OJ and all of those other big cases, then you'll probably be pretty familiar with it.
Yeah, I suspect that you're not hearing this for the first time, the Menendez brothers. Although I will tell you that unlike OJ trial, which occurred in the early 90s also, I followed that, day to day. I was fascinated by the litigation, and you could watch every night on TV, blow-by-blow discussion by among the best lawyers in the country. They would talk about, what happened that day, trial strategy, decisions, why a judge ruled in a particular way. It was virtually a litigation training course for a lawyer. Lawyers, any litigation lawyer across the country benefited hugely from that 8 months or so, and I think it was about that long, 8 months or so of daily coverage of this litigation. So you're seeing the best techniques. You can watch, an actual demonstration of a particular approach with an expert, et cetera. Don't get me started, but I learned a lot from the OJ thing. The Menendez brothers, I didn't follow that closely, so this has been interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think that might just be because, they were richer, they were a little bit more protected in the media. Now they're not much protected as they were, just because there's all these movies that are out about them, and, a lot of people know the name at the bare minimum. But yeah, so
Give just a thumbnail what happened, just in a paragraph, then we'll come back to it.
So on August 20th, 1989, as we all, maybe have heard, they went into their living room where their parents were watching a movie and sitting on the couch, and they did shoot them and they did kill them. A lot of people for a while thought it was a mob hit. Nobody really knew what happened. And this was in their really nice Beverly Hills neighborhood that had less than 2 deaths a year. So people were scared. People had no idea what went on. And they had to kind of get to the bottom of everything.
So we're going to approach this by first talking about the parents. A little bit of background, which I think lends something new to this whole subject. As we looked at the various sources of information over time, and of course there's a movie and lots of information, there wasn't much discussion, very little attention given to the father's career especially, and even to the mother as well, but the father especially. And I think that's important to kind of understand the course of this whole thing, not to explain or to justify anything that's happened here, of course. But I find it very interesting, the stories of people who are immigrants. They come to America. They enjoy huge success. They because they work very, very hard. They're just very driven and whatnot. So I found, as I read about the history of the dad, that it's just a very interesting story. So Jose came to the country at around 1960.
Yes, he was 16.
16 years old, and he had come had a chance to come from Cuba to be here because a sister was here.
Yes, and also it was when Castro was, overturning everything. So his parents kind of wanted him out.
The revolution.
Yeah, so his parents sent him to live with his sister, and they were like, go be like whatever you can be. We don't want you here anymore, which sounds mean, but during that's definitely what you wanted.
Yeah, and especially for the aristocracy. I mean, the Batista was. It was good there if you were part of the Cuban aristocracy or the Cuban mob or whatever other groups were well positioned in that economy at the time. So when you had this Marxist revolution with Castro, then suddenly the rules and the beneficiaries were turned upside down. So those who were at the top, were the ones who were vulnerable to being thrown in jail, and many were. Their fortunes, without exception, were taken.
Yep.
So it's probable that it's true what Jose had said, that his family had been affluent there. We don't know that, but we have reason to believe that perhaps that was the case, although they didn't have much money when they got here.
No, so his dad was a well-known soccer player, and his mom was actually a really well-known swimmer. His dad was also a really, well-known accountant. He did very well for them, but that was in Cuba, and when they came here, I don't think they had much left from all of that happening.
Okay. So so that does explain, though, the degree that Jose ended up getting.
Yes, yeah.
Strong roots are essential for a healthy tree, especially your family tree. That's why you work hard to take care of your family every day. At Tucker Allen, we know that taking care of your family means planning for the future. Our team provides personalized estate planning to help you protect your family, your legacy, and your future. From wills and trusts to long-term care and estate planning, count on Tucker Allen, personalized estate planning made simple.
Yeah, when Jose got here, he seemed to have to work very hard for everything he got. He was holding down jobs while he was going to school. Illinois State University. You wonder, how does he come from Cuba and end up in the middle of the country that way?
Yeah, so he did really well in high school. He got really good grades. He was into sports, but he couldn't afford an Ivy League school. So I think that was, this is kind of second best. This is probably where he got a scholarship, and that's why he was able to go there.
Yeah, so he did. He went to Illinois State University. Professors talked about the fact that he was very driven. Apparently, he would argue over, not argue. He would push for better grades. If he could gain a point, if he could move his grade up a little bit by doing an extra assignment. I mean, he was always somebody who was on top, trying to better his position with his grades. And I think this is a lifetime characteristic for Jose.
Yeah, I think it most definitely is. But when he was in college, he met his wife, Mary Louise Anderson, who goes by Kitty, as we'll all know her. And they hit it off. They got married and had some kids, and they kind of went from there.
So they met at Illinois State University.
That's correct.
And married around 64?
Yes, 64.
Okay.
And then they moved to New York, and that is where he finished his degree at Queen's University.
Yeah, Queen's College. And he got an accounting degree.
Yes.
Which we now are not surprised to hear. And ended up getting a job with a Big 8 firm, Coopers and Liebring.
Yes, that's correct. So he, when they were in New York, he had originally worked at that restaurant in Manhattan. I believe it was called 21. And then once he graduated, he got that job with them. And he, like you said, he was known to work his way up the corporate ladder. So I think he did. And then they had their boys, and he got the job with Hertz and RCA, and that's when they started moving out to California. Yeah,
and I think the way the Hertz job came about, as I understand it, was he had started with Coopers, which is a Big 8 firm. Back then, there was a Big 8. For those of you who aren't familiar with the accounting world, this is the most elite jobs available in the accounting field. Now they call them, there's down to a Big 4 still, I think. And these are just the mega CPA firms that are international. They're known around the world. Arthur Andersen now is gone, but that was one of those. And in order to get a job with them, you have to be in the top of your class in an accounting program, wherever they hire from. So So it tells me that the dad, really did that. Jose worked very hard. He got the grades. He was very ambitious. Everybody says that, including his professional peers as well as going through school. I mean, the comment you would hear over and over was that he was somebody who pushed things along. He was aggressive. He was determined and ambitious. So the story goes, he was working on the Hertz account.
Yes, that's correct.
And he gained familiarity with one of the parent companies?
RCA, yes.
Or a related entity?
Yeah, Radio Corporation of America. And that's kind of how he worked his way into that film industry. So in 1986, he left RCA, and that's when he moved his family out to California, and he started working for Carol Co.
Okay. Now, and let me pause a little bit on the RCA portion of his career. He had actually worked in the division that he was in charge of, which was RCA Records. He was actually COO effectively, and he was a hard charger, and employees. Some had very good things to say about him. Others would say that he was tough, he was difficult. People who had negotiated with him and did business across the table from him said that he's not going to leave anything on the table, meaning he never missed any possibility in negotiations to better his position, which is something you want in somebody that is representing your company as an executive, particularly somebody in a C-suite position. So he was very successful apparently, and RCA Records did very well, but it turned out that somebody new came on board. There had been, I think, a change in ownership of RCA at the time. And so they wanted to put someone else in the spot, which means that no longer would Jose be in line for the CEO spot there of that division. So he chose to leave, and he landed at Carol Co.
Carol Co., yeah.
Yeah, and they placed him in charge as CEO of a division.
Yes, that's correct. He was the CEO of, I can't remember what division, but he helped.
Live entertainment is what it became.
Yeah. He took over that division, and it was called IVE before, and he reconstructed it, kind of brought it back to life, and really made it huge and something that was, really big for them.
So, I mean, he was really in charge of kind of running this company, so to speak, and part of their challenges was to be able to bring on talent, to sign them on, and to have them as clients, and to make money from their performances as well as their recordings and distributions. And he brought on some top talent, didn't he? There were some that were named in one of the articles.
Yeah. So at RCA, he brought on Duran Duran and Muendo, which they're like Latin labels.
Oh, yeah.
But when he moved over to that Carol Co. Pictures, I believe he also helped produce Rambo. So that was more on the movie side of things, and then RCA was more on the record label side of things. But he definitely had a hand in a lot of big names becoming even bigger.
So, I mean, he was definitely somebody who came to America really determined to succeed, and this is what I think makes America so special in many ways, is that immigrant story, because America does provide this great opportunity for people who want to take advantage of it. And it seems that immigrants are more willing often to take advantage of it than those of us who are born here.
Yeah.
Now, let me say this too. We're trying to flesh out a picture of the parents a little bit in fairness, so you know some background. A little story that I think, just kind of sheds more light on the fact that Jose was very ambitious, and he always wanted to make the numbers, and no one accused him of being dishonest or unethical that I saw. However, he was willing to bend the rules. For example, one of the disputes that related to his not getting the CEO spot in RCA Records was supposedly that it's called pre-shipping or overshipping. It's where you send out a lot more recordings to record companies and to, I guess, music stores and other distribution outlets for these recordings, more than in fact is the request, more than perhaps is likely to sell in the short term. So this was a way that it pushed up the numbers. It made the artists look more successful because these were reported as shipped numbers, and then it ends up that, and this is an old trick in the industry, I think, when you're trying to push your talent. Those end up later being sent back, and they're sold at a substantial discount. So while it can be useful in the short term, it's not a good long-term strategy. And another thing is sometimes it can affect bonuses and whatnot. So that's another gray area about someone choosing this as a strategy. But it's consistent with Jose's personality that he was determined to succeed. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about Kitty.
Yeah, definitely. So Kitty Menendez was born to a middle-class family in Chicago. Her father owned an air conditioning business, but she didn't have the greatest family life. Her father was abusive, and like we said, she met Jose at Southern Illinois University, and they hit it off. They had a great time, but her parents didn't like the marriage because he was Cuban, and Jose's parents didn't like the marriage because her parents had eventually gotten divorced. So there was kind of a bit of turmoil there, but they went on to get married. They had it seemed pretty happy at first, but it wasn't kind of quite all that. She eventually went down the road of prescription drugs and kind of got into that, and whenever she had the boys, she just did end up becoming a homemaker. So for most of her life, she didn't really, she didn't have a job. She just relied on Jose for everything. But that's kind of just how everything went. He wanted to take care of her, so she did, and she took care of the boys.
Yeah, and she did some modeling or something. What did I see her listed as?
She did some. I think she dabbled in filmmaking and a bit of modeling. She was an elementary teacher before having the boys, but I think all of it was very short-lived. I think it was only like a 5-year span of all of that. And
it's we should emphasize though that given the earnings that Jose was generating, I mean, clearly it was a lot of money. He would have been the breadwinner of the family even if she were employed because of his responsibilities. The thing about being a CEO of a company, even though it's partially or I guess majority owned by another company, the majority owning company was Carolco, but this Entertainment Live was an entity over which Menendez, Jose, was CEO, and that means that whatever profits were generated, et cetera, doubtlessly his compensation plan was very heavy on incentives. So there was no reason to believe that he wouldn't continue to do very well. He had done well his whole career. Everywhere he had managed had been very successful. He didn't really have any failures in his professional career. So even leaving RCA, that division, RCA Records, it wasn't because he had failed in any way. As a matter of fact, he was done very well. But a little bit of it was politics, a little bit was his management approach, but still, there was no reason to believe that this family would not have continued to do better and their standard of living continued to grow and grow and grow, particularly given Jose's work ethic.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think he ever had a plan to retire.
So when we talk about then kind of what the family standard of living is, it's a good doorway for us to enter regarding what the assets, the family had accumulated.
Yes.
Let's start with this house they were living in.
Yeah, so their Beverly Hills mansion, it was appraised at $4.8 million.
Now this is in 89.
Yes, yeah. So very big, very expensive house. It was previously owned by Elton John and Prince.
Not at the same time.
Yeah, not at the same time. So we know that it must have been somewhere very nice for them. They had cars, jewelry, clothing, all sorts of things. But they also had their Calabasas house, which was it was estimated to be around $2.65 million.
And that's a vacation home?
Yes, it was their vacation home. And, Calabasas now is where the Kardashians are. That's where everybody wants to be.
Where is Calabasas? I don't know anything about that. Hey, Justin, can you look that up? Okay. So this is a really hot destination or vacation
Yes,
spot.
And I don't know.
Let's see, it's in California, and it is just a little north of Los Angeles.
Okay.
So it must be enough away to where it becomes kind of a weekend?
Yes, it's become a very, very private community now, and those homes are just ridiculously expensive. You have to be somebody to be able to get into them. Like I said, the Kardashians live there. A bunch of other big names live in that area. So, it's kind of that weekend getaway for them. I think that's what it was in, the 80s, 90s, and now it's become that whole big thing.
So, and they were not, though they definitely lived a very nice lifestyle, they did accumulate some savings and they had some other assets. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so they did have their stocks in the live entertainment business, and it was around $6.5 million.
That was the estimated value at the time.
Yes, they had about $600,000 in savings, and they had a bunch of stocks and bonds, investments, things like that. So it's not like, they weren't reinvesting the money. It's not like it was all completely take-home money and they were spending everything.
Yeah, they weren't living beyond their means.
No, definitely not. I mean...
But they also were not living below their means.
No, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a situation like the Waltons, for example, where Sam Walton notoriously lived below his means. Well, we're talking about much less money here. But my point is, I think they probably lived a lifestyle that was typical of somebody with their assets.
Yes. Yeah, I would completely agree. And I think that was also, that was all the boys had ever known, too. So for Kitty and Jose, that was also, we're living on top of the world when, we don't want to be without money also because that's how they kind of came from. They never wanted to live outside of their means, so they didn't lose everything.
Yeah. And one thing let me comment on, too, regarding these securities. It's a shame in many ways why events took the course that they did. And among the ways, ironically, is that this asset of the securities, that was 7,000 or so shares, these really had value primarily because of the management and leadership of Jose. So this is kind of a closely held entity. It's not publicly held, and a majority interest is held by Carol Co. So it's not uncommon when you have somebody that you're trying to lure on board or take a CEO spot, you offer them stock options and you offer them stock incentives. And this can happen, of course, at all levels of an organization, but it happens particularly in the C-suite level. So Jose had obviously gotten stock guarantees. He had some of those had matured, and those that were no longer contingent were the 7,000 or so shares. We can't imagine how many shares he might have had a claim to had he continued to live, because those were contingent. So to the extent that he didn't continue working there and performing, then of course he would lose those shares. But the shares that were clearly vested was the 7,000 or so. And they had this like $6.8 million estimate.
Yeah, that's correct.
And yet it was a very vulnerable number, because closely held entities, notoriously, appraisers will tell you this, when you're appraising the value of a company that you own a minority interest, for example, in a closely held company, that's called a minority discount. So whenever somebody's in that position, as he was, you can be sure that it's great if ultimately he's able to sell those shares under good conditions, where he has a relationship, and that's often the way it happens, is you sell them to somebody, an investor that you know is coming in, or you sell them back to the company like a buyback agreement. There's all sorts of ways where you can be pretty confident you'll get 100% on the dollar based on how the company is doing and your percent interest in that company. But whenever you're doing something that is essentially an auction scenario or a distress scenario, those types of assets are far and away hit the hardest. They're the ones where you can see a company, an interest in a small company, and maybe it's a 10% interest. You'll see that interest otherwise worth $100,000 will become worth 20.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets hugely punished because the people who have an interest, who have the ability to buy that, are really in a position to dictate the price. And by contrast, a third party with no relationship buying into that situation where they're vulnerable to the sort of manipulations and whatnot when you're that sort of distinct minority, not only a minority owner in a small business, but also an outsider. So you come in as an outsider. The insiders have the majority interest. It's just not where you want to be as an investor typically. So for all those reasons, whenever you're having an appraisal in a probate estate, or quite frankly, in any other circumstance, even the IRS, when they're trying to determine what are they going to charge you for the value of a transaction, et cetera, they will concede that there are huge discounts for a minority interest that might exist. And also whenever you're talking about inherently, a small company. So in this case, these shares, we'll talk about in a few minutes, what the impact was on the probate estate. But we wanted to first talk about, kind of the nature of their wealth and to give you a sense of that. And they didn't have a whole lot of liquid money lying around. Most of it was tied up. Their value was tied up, in the house?
In both houses and the stocks.
That was over half, at least. Yeah,
definitely. It was the estate was estimated to be around $14 million, a little over $14 million whenever they died.
Okay. And I should mention one other thing, too. The discount, whenever you talk about a minority discount, much of that discount also is related to a lack of control. So it'd be different if you had a minority interest, but you had controls where maybe the others were non-voting, so maybe you did have control, but even though it's a minority interest. You'd still have a discount as a minority interest, but not as much. But in this case, I'm sure the shares were typical common stock shares, in which case, you're a minority owner with very little control over events. So it's not a good place to be in. So here we have the real estate and we have these securities, and we should make clear, this was not a fortune that was tottering on the brink of collapse. No. Things had these people's lives go on the way that they thought they would go on. Certainly Kitty and Jose, the way they thought it would go on. I would bet, of their continued growth in wealth and success, it wasn't vulnerable financially, despite what happened to the value of the probate estate, which we'll talk about in a minute. So before we get to that, we want to now shift back and talk about the boys. Yeah. So we know they were living a luxurious lifestyle. We know there was financial security. Talk a little bit about Erik and Lyle.
Yeah, so Erik and Lyle were their two sons. They both were, very good in tennis. Erik a bit more so. They were both pretty smart. They weren't just... They were average, though, and there's nothing wrong. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being average, but their dad wanted them to be way, way more. He wanted the best of the best out of them, and that kind of frustrated them. So as kids, they kind of just did what they were told, but as they grew into teens and, older than that, they kind of started going against what their parents wanted. Erik was a ladies' man too, and his mom never liked any of the girls that he brought home. They were always models or, like exotic dancers, things like that. Yeah.
I can understand that.
So they wanted the best for them. They didn't want to be seen as like the family with, our son is, dating this person, and that's just not right. They just wanted to be that perfect, like quintessential family.
Yeah. I don't hear the word tiger dad used. We hear tiger mom. Is there a phrase for tiger dad?
I think it's around the same.
Yeah. It's that I keep coming back because, I do think that immigrants, especially from whatever part of the world they're from, I think they have this determination that their children be huge beneficiaries of the American dream.
Yeah, their father just demanded basically excellence, and he wanted them to follow in his business footsteps. And, he wanted it to be the trio of dad and sons doing this, and this, and just gaining more and more wealth. But
do we believe that the dad wanted the sons to go into business?
Yeah, that's what he pushed them towards. When they started getting into college, he wanted them to get accounting degrees. He wanted them to get business degrees. they didn't want that. They just, like I had said, they had grown up in money. They didn't know really what work looked like. Yeah, they weren't motivated or anything, and I think that really frustrated their dad.
So they went to college?
They went for a bit. I couldn't find which colleges they went to, but they went for like on and off for a couple of years, but neither graduated with a degree. They were both around 21. There was a 2-year age gap. Lyle's the oldest, and he was 21, and then Erik was around 18, 19 at the time of the murders.
Just close to 19.
So yeah, they were going into college, but they had kind of dabbled, but they were like, this isn't for me because my parents have the money.
So there's no serious effort in college, so they're in and out in terms of their course load, I imagine. Lackluster students, we already knew that.
Yes.
So tennis was the younger Erik. Wasn't he very good?
He was very good. He wasn't, a national well-known player good though. And I think he could have been if he really wanted to and he had the drive for that. But I think it came from his dad, that his dad wanted him to have the drive for it. So I think in some sense he enjoyed it, but it was kind of his father trying to live through him within that sport.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were both good at tennis. I mean, they both enjoyed it to a certain extent, and as we'll go on and see, they hired a tennis coach and so on and so forth. And they did travel for tennis matches, but not anything massive. They didn't make any giant names for themselves out of it.
So I think that our viewers can kind of get this impression that we have, and that I think is probably roughly the picture. None of us will never know all the details, but I think we have a dad who was probably a little overbearing.
Yes.
That was his nature. We know that mother, did not have a good childhood. She claimed there was some physical abuse. She might have even mentioned some sexual abuse.
Yes.
I don't know, but the divorce, occurred in her family. Jose had not known that. Probably a good Catholic family, I'm sure. And so Mom, I'm going to jump to the conclusion that Mom may not have been Mother of the Year.
Yeah, I don't think either of them were parents or marriage of the year, because Jose was known to also have mistresses, and that's...
Oh, was he?
Yeah, that's kind of why Kitty went off the deep end also with the prescriptions and all of that. So the boys also saw all of that.
Okay, so we'll pick up maybe some of that, and we'll talk here in a few minutes about what the kids' defense. So the stage is set where the kids are not happy. We know that they come in, they kill the parents. But was there a triggering event?
The only triggering event that I heard of was there was one night when there was a couple. So there was one night when Kitty went off on Lyle, and Lyle ran out to the pool house, or to their guest house, and Erik was out there, and both of the brothers just cried in each other's arms, and they talked about, the abuse that they were going through and that they had, quote unquote, kept hidden from each other. And this is what they told the courts. And they both promised each other that they would never hold a secret again. And that's kind of when they probably thought out a plan to do everything. That's what it's kind of thought to be. And then a little bit before that also, and this goes back to the will and why people think that they killed their parents for the money. Kitty had a friend. It was in, I believe, 1988. They had a family friend come and visit them, and she was typing on their computer, and the friend was like, "What are you doing?" And Kitty was like, "I'm updating our will. I don't want the boys in it anymore." And Lyle had been standing in the hallway and, probably heard that. And then in 1989, in May of 1989, because they died in August, their father had also been talking to another family friend that he was completely taking everything away from the boys. So,
and we think the boys knew about that conversation too.
Yes, and I think they had slowly started taking things away from them and cutting them off, and that is kind of what just got the ball rolling on everything. And then that tied into all of the emotional stuff, and then it just went from there.
And we have to kind of speculate on what the father's side of the story would be, because we don't have that. But and that's where my mind naturally aligns is with Dad. But my suspicion would be that he sees that the sons are becoming these playboys of sorts, and that they, as a father, I can see where, particularly with his personality, he would be thinking, I'm speculating, that perhaps, we need to pull back some of the fruits of their lifestyle and let's force them to confront responsibility.
Yes.
So I could see that as a parenting strategy.
Yeah, and they were kind of like toddlers. They were just like, well, I want this and this and this. And their dad was like, we can't afford that, even though they thought that they could. So that's kind of how all of that happened too.
So there may have been a confrontation of some sort with one of the boys with Mom, and that might have prompted a conversation between the boys. So take us then through the murder, set up the events that night. And many of you have seen this perhaps depicted. Did you see the movie?
Yeah, there's a movie. There's that Netflix documentary. There's a whole lot of things now. So
okay, so tell us what everyone agrees on that probably happened, or what the police would certainly say happened.
Yeah. So obviously, the boys went in, point blank, shot their parents.
And this was in the evening?
Yes, this was in the evening. They had said that they were going out to the movies. And, well, this is what they told the police. They told the police they had been going out to the movies, and then they came back, shot their parents. But they told the police they had came back and found their parents dead because they had forgotten Erik's ID. So
originally their story was they were going to the movie. They didn't actually go.
They didn't actually go, and that's when they committed the murder. And they had told their parents they were leaving the house. I can't remember what for. So they did leave the house, but then they came back, snuck in on them, and killed them.
And they were shot from behind?
That's correct. They were watching, I believe it was the movie 10 Commandments, and they were shot from behind on their couch.
Wow.
Yeah.
The movie, the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
And, of course, thou shalt honor their parents.
Yep.
So they were shot from the back of the head?
They were shot from the back. The dad was. Kitty had fallen asleep. If we want to get a little bit more into it, Kitty had fallen asleep on the couch. She woke up because she obviously heard the gunshot. She started running down the hall, and that's when they shot her. And they did try to make it look like mob murders so that they would throw off the police. And then as they had told the police, they called, and if you've ever heard like a recording of the phone call, it's kind of chilling because
to 911.
To 911. It's pretty chilling because there's no emotion behind it. Like if you had found your parents, shot, you probably would be screaming, crying, and they just kind of called and they were like, "Hey, something happened. Can we get some police here?" And so they went there, and ironically enough, they had gunshot residue on their hands, and if the police had tested them that night, they wouldn't have had to go through everything.
So the police didn't at that time think that they were...
No, because it was such a nice family and such a nice neighborhood that they never suspected that the kids did it. But then kind of things started getting a little weird because they had that gunshot residue. And then the same night that the police had been investigating their house, the boys went back at 3 a.m. and the police were still there. They were still, getting evidence, everything like that. And they were like, "We need to get our tennis rackets." And the police were like, "Why do you need your tennis rackets?" Well, they were hiding some evidence that they had left behind. They were hiding like the clothes they had changed out of and everything like that. So that's kind of what tipped police off. And then if we want to get into it, the aftermath, they both got $250,000 from their parents' life insurance immediately. That was paid out. And they weren't acting like kids who had just lost their parents. They were acting like kids who had just come into a lot of wealth. The brothers spent all of that money, and Lyle went on a spending spree, and he got Rolex watches, a Porsche Carrera.
And this is within days.
Yes, this is all within 6 months that they spent $700,000 of just the life insurance.
But the Rolexes, didn't he buy 3 Rolexes before the funeral?
Yes, Erik did, and then he wore them to the funeral. One of them, but yeah, and. Yeah, so they hired they hired that tennis coach at like $40,000. Erik got a Jeep Wrangler, just all sorts of weird things. I even heard that they purchased like a wing restaurant called, like, I think the company's now called Fat Boy Wings or something like that. But
like $300,000 or something.
Yeah, and they wanted to franchise it. It was just the weirdest things that they were buying. It wasn't them, mourning their parents, planning out the funeral, anything like that. They just ran off with the money, and they were kind of like, okay, this is great. We're rich now, and just waited for the rest of the will to pay out.
So the probate estate, of course, would have been opened almost virtually immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to probate the estate, the personal representative has to determine, first of all, has to look at the will,
Mm-hmm.
and in this case there was a will, but then has to determine who would be the beneficiaries of the will, even if it says a particular person or persons. In this case, the children were presumably named.
Yeah, so at first they didn't think there was a will, and then they found one that had been typed and placed in a bathroom cabinet. I don't understand that. I will never understand that. But it was dated 1980, and it said,
there's no theory as to why it was placed there.
No, I just think that
maybe they were hiding it.
I don't know. And they may have been, and I think that Lyle might have been arrogant enough that he was like, oh, I don't need an estate attorney. I don't need anything like that. I'm going to do it on my own. Because that just kind of...
Lyle or
excuse me, not Lyle, Jose.
Yeah.
So I don't really know if they were hiding it. I don't know why they would hide it from the boys if the boys were named. But there was a lot of speculation to this. But they found that one. And then...
And that was signed.
Yes, that was signed.
Signed and properly executed.
Yes, signed and dated 1980. And then there was speculation that there was a will on the family computer because of what the family friend had said, that Kitty had been typing on it. So the boys had been on the East Coast. Sorry, I forgot my directions right there. And for the memorial, and then they flew back. And when they heard this, and they were freaking out because they didn't want anybody to find another will that said it's going to anybody but them. So they hired a computer expert at that time, and they had them wipe all the files that said Lyle, Erik, and Will. And the computer expert later on went to say, oh, I thought those were like human names, not a will and testimony. So the computer expert wiped them, and then the boys asked them to re-upload them as blank documents. So they were still technically there, but there was nothing actually in them.
But there was a will document there. They found the will document.
Well, and that was what the computer expert, he didn't read into anything, but there was a will document that he deleted. He just didn't put eyes on it.
I see. So he knows it was there. So that woman's testimony was correct.
Yes.
That one was being prepared.
Yeah, and so they had no choice but to go with the actual physical copy.
With what was signed, because that would be the valid will. And in this case, though, the probate court couldn't continue because one of the issues was when they were charged, these two sons, if they were found guilty, then there's the Slayer statute, which is in California, and a similar statute exists in virtually all 50 states, which says that if you kill somebody, you can't be the beneficiary. You can't kill them and get to collect their life insurance. Typically, these statutes, almost without exception, they include life insurance, they include a beneficiary in a will, any sort of beneficiary clause, including a beneficiary designation for compensation benefits, et cetera. So transfer on death, POD, TOD, all those things virtually are captured by these Slayer statutes. So that meant that while the probate estate was open and costs are being incurred, incidentally, keep in mind, this is a resounding theme on this show. Lots of people are getting paid, particularly when the deceased was rich. In this case, we have a couple that's gone. There's a personal representative appointed, not the children, and this personal representative is incurring costs, valuing assets, trying to accumulate assets, court appearances, experts, appraisals. I mean, just lots of money's being spent, and it's not just by these two boys. So the boys are going free for how long?
for about 6 months. And the way that they were arrested was they had a previous therapist. His name was Dr. Oziel. And they started going to see, well, actually, Dr. Oziel reached out to them because he knew about their parents' murder. And he was like, hey, why don't you come in? Like, we can talk about all of this. So
was
the boys,
he a psychologist?
Yes.
Okay.
So the boys did. And he had previously been Erik's therapist. But the brothers went in to see him. And just over, like, the course of everything, they admitted to the murders to him because they thought they were under patient-doctor confidentiality.
Well, you would think.
Yeah. And it goes later on to say that, well, I'll get into that. But so Oziel confided in his mistress, Judalon Smith, and one night something happened and she got mad at him. So she actually went to the police and she told them that, hey, I know who murdered their, Jose and Kitty Menendez. It was their sons. I even have recorded
She had the tapes, or did her husband have the tapes?
It was her boyfriend, and she broke into his office to get the tapes. So she went and got the tapes from him, and she said that I have a confession recorded, and she gave it all to them. And the police arrested them in March of 1990.
But now, and I guess those of you who are watching the show, waiting for me to explain to you maybe why that seemingly illegal evidence got in, and instead I'm saying to you, I don't know the answer to that question. I should know, but I don't.
So they found that it was basically what happened was they took the recordings, but they didn't take the confession. So they didn't find it admissible in court. They didn't allow them to speak about the confession in the recordings. They just went around everything because they said other things that were almost
felt were usable.
Yes, were almost just evidence-wise, but they didn't use the actual tape of the confession. So that's how they got around that whole loophole.
Because normally you would think that therapist-patient, confidentiality, that's something that exists. It's similar to doctor-patient, lawyer-client. I mean, so it creates what's called a privilege, and the person who holds the privilege is the client or the patient, meaning the client can waive it, but the doctor can't. So the client is the sole holder of the ability to decide whether that privilege is upheld and enforced. And in this case, obviously, the Menendezes would have both said, "No, we want this therapist-client confidentiality to be enforced." In this case, though, you have this problem magnified by the therapist broke the confidentiality by telling somebody else.
Yes.
So that clearly is unethical. A lawyer would get, if you don't get disbarred, you'd certainly be suspended for something like that, or at least admonished.
Yeah, and that's kind of what they went down the lines as. And their lawyer also their lawyer in the very beginning, I don't know his name because he didn't stay around long, but he also kind of messed it up because they hired an attorney when their parents died. They didn't confess to anything, but they wanted to make sure that they had one. And their attorney should have told them, go see Dr. Oziel, or had some sort of paperwork that said, oh, I, the lawyer, am telling him to go there, because then they wouldn't have been able to use any of it.
It's work product.
And then they also messed up because at the time of their arrest, Erik had been in Israel for a tennis match, and if the lawyer had gone and told Erik to go to London, they couldn't have extradited him because California has the death penalty, and so California would have had to say, we won't charge him with the death penalty if you extradite him, and they would have had to uphold that the entire time. So that was still on the table. They would have gotten him off a death penalty
charge. So, I see lots of things wrong with that piece of evidence. Then, of course, in addition to the confidentiality issue, the privilege, you also have the fact that, someone committed a crime. So normally when evidence is tainted like that, generally it's inadmissible.
Yeah.
But you just explained where the most incriminating parts were excluded for whichever of those several reasons.
Yeah, just that they couldn't use the confession in their testimony. And
so they're allowed to run loose and spend money for about 6 months, from August until March of 90. And then March of 90 is when they're arrested. They're held, or are they loose? Are they allowed out on bond?
They're not. Well, they didn't have any money left over to be able to be allowed out on bail. Things started moving. We'll see that the case took a while, but things did move pretty quickly in that sense. So they were allowed out on bail, but they couldn't afford it. So they didn't run loose after that. They were in jail up until they were officially charged.
So we won't go into the excruciating detail that I'm sure others have already done, mainly criminal lawyers. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but there's much interest for those of you who want to know the details of these 3 different trials. Was it a 4th one that ultimately convicted them?
It was a 3rd one that convicted them. So there was 2 deadlocked juries to begin with, and then in the 3rd, they so what had happened in the 2 before is they had said stuff about sexual assault, abuse, and everything going on with that. And then the prosecution had said things about how they were killing them just for their parents' money. And so eventually, when they had that second deadlocked jury, the judge was like, okay, we can't say anything about abuse anymore. We can't say anything about how they went after their parents' money. You're going to have to give me some other evidence. So they threw all that out. They had the 3rd trial, and that was when they finally were charged with murder.
Meaning they were convicted?
Yes, they were convicted.
Yeah. So convicted finally in 96. Mm-hmm. So the first trial was when?
It was 1991.
So think about this. This probate estate was open for this entire period of time. And the asset value at the threshold of all this litigation, or at least at the death, when the probate was open, probate case. So that would have been around $14.6 million. Mm-hmm. And then later there was some additional money that could have been added to that. But as you point out, immediately, these boys, both of them really equally. You can't say Erik or Lyle was primarily the one going through the money. They both, with great enthusiasm, started spending money. And but the money that they were able to spend during that 6-month period of time, though, was primarily around the assets that were liquid enough for them to be able to get to. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the value of the house, as well as these shares of stock, 7,000 or so shares, those were probably more than half the total value. Mm-hmm. And it's sad, even with respect to those assets. I kind of set the stage for the fact that when the 7,000 shares were sold, that they would take a hit for those reasons. What did they actually sell for?
Yeah, they sold for only around $500,000.
That is shocking. Now, that's not typical. In addition to all those other reasons I mentioned, it had lost its leadership, that it accounted for much of the growth. So, which of course is one of the victims here.
Yeah, and it was definitely tainted by that too.
That's an intangible, but I think it's real. I think even in the business world, people sometimes are uncomfortable with certain assets.
Yeah. And
not on a purely rational basis. We have rational reasons, incidentally, why this company, but apart from the rational is just the fact that it's tainted. And so imagine the impact on the wealth. And when you think of the waste that happens here, and not all of it can be blamed on the probate process, but much of it can. And in this case, I think that the estate planning, had it been handled differently, there's no question that much more value would have been preserved in the estate, even given the behavior of these boys. And it might have even prevented what happened had it been set up correctly.
Yes.
Because, as you know, we're an advocate of trusts on here, almost without exception, rich or poor. So the house ultimately sold, and what did the house sell for?
The house sold for $3.6 million, which was a loss of $1.1 million on it.
So now houses definitely get tainted.
Yeah, especially if the murder happened inside of it. And they had to disclose that. Under California law, you have to disclose if there was a murder in the house or if the house is haunted, quote unquote.
Are you serious?
Yeah. In some states, you're required to. Up to haunted is a different one than murder. So usually it's about 6 or 7 years in most states that you have to disclose it, and then you don't have to anymore. And then haunted, in Louisiana, you have to disclose if it's haunted no matter what. I think there's a couple of other states that have like year-long limits, and yeah.
That's new to me. But so this house suffered in terms of its sales price, and it didn't even do well after that because it was sold. It was sold again in 93?
Yes, so it was sold to a Saudi prince. He tried to sell it, and then he couldn't, so he rented it out for $50,000 a month. Then he sold it to, I cannot remember his name.
But somebody in
the
93.
writer, yeah.
A published writer.
Mm-hmm. And he sold it to him for $3.7 million. And then that writer sold it in 2001, so a 10-year gap he sold it for $3.6 million to the writer, and then in that 10-year gap, he only sold it for $3.7 million to the new executive person who owned it.
Think about that.
Yeah.
10-year period in California when they had lots of appreciation during this period of time. So you won't be surprised to hear that pretty much all the assets were consumed.
Yeah.
Whatever little left at the end, and we couldn't even find an actual number because it's insignificant. Nobody cared. But there was a number, and it could have been as little as a few thousand, $10,000, but it went to cousins. There were some living relatives, but it's a shame. So the Slayer statute prevented the children from getting anything. The attorneys, our best guesstimate is that attorney fees were north of $7 million. We've seen different estimates. The best estimate up to 94 was $5 million. And so we know that that third major trial that resulted in conviction in 96 was easily was another couple million. So
yeah, and they paid that $4 million in estate taxes, which could have been prevented also if he had actually set up a will or anything and not just put it in a bathroom drawer.
Yeah. I'm going to have to add to the list of having a trust to keep your children from killing you.
Yeah, yes.
But that definitely is a point worth making.
Which is
because
horrible. But
when you have a trust in place, it eliminates all those motives because there are rules. And they can kill you, but there's a trustee. And they can kill that trustee, and there will be a successor trustee. So, but apart from that obvious point is there should have been a trust for the reasons that you want control, especially for kids like this. Assuming they hadn't killed their parents, they needed a trust if their parents just had a car accident because these kids are going to do exactly what they did, go through and spend everything. These are the kids where should be a poster child situation where you want a trust. Either because you disincentivize your children killing you, but more for wider application, I hope, is the idea that you want children such as this to have some levels of control. And then there are a whole list of other reasons for people whose children are well-behaved and disciplined, still different reasons for them, additional reasons, not having to do with some of the same concerns that we would have with Lyle and Erik. But in this case, the taxes would have been eliminated, the value of the shares of stock. We can talk about that. What if that had been in a trust and had been sold under controlled circumstances or even held? It could have been held indefinitely as need be by the trustee. There was no need to dump those shares in a time frame that by definition magnified the losses. Instead, a trustee can at leisure convert assets from one form to another at leisure, which means over years they can choose to do it because the trustee has the discretion to do what's not primarily in the interest of the beneficiaries in the short term, but in their ultimate best interest. So they have almost this parental discretion. You can choose to give them that degree of discretion that would have preserved the value of these assets, not to mention cut off the access to these kids while they were having this huge 6-month party after the death of their parents. So this is a sad story.
it is. It's sad all the way around. I mean, the parents had their flaws, but they definitely didn't deserve what happened to them. And then just the boys are just a whole other side of things. And
Yeah. I'm surprised that these juries were deadlocked in the first 2 trials, but
they sympathized with them. And I mean, they did find evidence of that stuff. They made really good points, and they had very good testimony, but they definitely humanized themselves in court. They weren't like the serial killers or the murderers that we see that just sit there. They did cry. They did talk about all of it.
Did they testify? Do you know?
They did. Both of them did in their separate cases. And that's why they were deadlocked. And then that's why the judge threw it out. He's like, I don't want to hear anything about it. And I think that was just because the judge knew. I mean, there was nobody else that they had found that could have possibly even done it. So, and the boys had obviously confessed also. So he just threw it out, and he didn't want to hear any more of it.
So the ultimate sentence in 96 was?
They got life in prison. They don't have parole. And
without possibility of parole.
Yeah, without possibility of parole. They're both around 50 now, and they were in the same prison together in California. I cannot remember the name, but they were in the same prison together in California. But then I believe Lyle got moved somewhere else in California recently.
Yeah, I think I saw they were in separate prisons.
Yeah, but they're kind of infamous. I mean, like you said, it wasn't necessarily well known because they got tied up in that OJ case. But down the road, everybody made a name for them because they were like, they couldn't believe it. It's just wild to see a family like that go from the top of the world to just nothing.
Yeah. Well, so this was one that we selected because it's kind of the closest thing to a Halloween show that we can come up with. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found some life lessons. Maybe your children would find some life lessons as well. But in any case, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.